judge delivering her sentence, the former gymnastics team doctor Larry Nassar, standing across from her, sentenced to up to 175 years in prison. The judge who delivered that sentence, as I mentioned...
This is a case about USA gymnastics sex abuse scandal, which involves the sexual abuse of female athletes, primarily minors, over 2 decades. 368 individuals have been sexually assaulted by gym owners, coaches, and staff working for gymnastic programs across the country. Particularly, longtime USA Gymnastics USAG national doctor Larry Nassar has been named in hundreds of lawsuits filed by athletes who said that Nassar engaged in sexual abuse under the pretense of providing medical care for at least 14 years. Marisa Kwiatkowski, a journalist of Indianapolis Star, investigated this issue deeply. The result of investigation has aroused public concern. Marisa said her initial assignment was to cover failures to report sexual abuse in schools. A source told her to look into USA Gymnastics and how its leadership handled sexual abuse allegations. The source told her a judge was about to seal court documents from USA Gymnastic cases, so Kwiatkowski flew to Georgia, where a former gymnast had filed the lawsuit against her coach. To meet their investigation standpoint of what is the impact of that policy on the safety of children in the sport, Marisa and her colleagues started with publicly available information to begin that investigation. They took a list that USA Gymnastics keeps of coaches banned from the organization, and they started doing background checks. They looked up all those people by gathering police records and court records and other things to figure out how many of these officials had USA Gymnastics received complaints about and known about prior to them abusing more people. And then how many people were harmed because that policy or that practice wasn't reported. Early in their investigation, they knew from records that USA Gymnastics had a record of not reporting all allegations of sexual abuse to authorities, which was contrary to the state law in many cases. That was, USA Gymnastic executives had followed a policy of dismissing complaints as hearsay, unless they were signed by a victim or victim's parents. Actually, they were supposed to turn it over to the police or the Department of Child Services when they received an allegation that a child was being sexually abused. However, what they actually did was, they received a complaint and they would only look further into it if it was signed by a victim or a victim's parents. And if you know anything about sexual abuse, that's incredible, because it is impossible that you would have like a 9-year-old child signing a "yes, I was sexually abused." After that, they tried to find an intermediary like an attorney, a victim advocate, or a detective, or a deputy prosecutor to contact the victims. The intermediary are people that they know who knew about the abuse, through them to make sure that it was somebody who knows what happened and might be willing to connect with them, with that individual. Then Marisa and her colleague just called them at work and said, "Hey, so I heard you were sexually abused and was hoping you might be willing to talk to me." Jamie Dancher, an Olympian who was one of the first Larry Nassar survivors, came forward to them, but she was initially not named. Marisa thought she had an obligation to explain to her that even if news reports did not name her, people could still identify who she was and what that could mean for her. So they had a full conversation about what naming versus not naming would mean. She later allowed them to name her. Unfortunately, Jamie was probably the most difficult of Nassar's survivors that Marisa had to interview, because people later blamed her on social media. They started saying she was a drunk or she was promiscuous, and started making all those terrible comments about her on social media. However, she knew prior to that, knowing that there was a possibility of facing such attack, about the risk of coming forward. During the investigations about sexual crimes, a lot of times the documentation that was not available becomes really important. Hence, they tried to get some patient medical and health records. However, most of the documents under most state laws were not public domain. In order to get the documentation, they had requested the Indianapolis Star, owned by Garnett, to file the motion to intervene and a lawsuit in Georgia to get access to documents that should have been public record in the first place. And after 2 trips to the Georgia Supreme Court, ultimately they won. At the end of the editing process, their first piece on USA Gymnastics had 13 editors. It was because their investigation was not running only in Indianapolis, but also searched in other papers all over the country. So that if there was any challenge or confrontation, they would point to exactly why they felt the information was relevant.
You don't know the half of it, trust me.
What's the half of it? Tell me the half of it, Mitch.
Off the record?
Off the record.
3 years ago, I get a call from an ex-priest, Anthony Benzovich. He was at Blessed Sacrament back in '62.
This is another case of sexual abuse told by Mike Rezendes.
Taking little boys.
The investigation of Mike revealed Catholic priests, nuns, and members of religious orders sexually abused children. In the 20th and 21st century, the cases have involved many allegations, investigations, trials, convictions, and revelations about decades of attempts by church officials to cover up reported incidents. Mike, an American journalist, was the recipient of a Pulitzer Prize for his investigative work for the Boston Globe. He had traced this case for a long time as a member of the Spotlight group in Boston Globe and revealed the dark side of the Catholic Church.
I give a presentation like this and I show that scene from the Spotlight movie, which I assume most people have seen, where I'm sitting on a bench outside a courthouse, and this lawyer tells me that there are these records that will show that there's been a cover-up, of a decades-long cover-up of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church in Boston. And getting the documents can be very, very complicated. I mean, in this case, Mitchell Garabedian was an attorney. Nobody knew who he was. He was a sole practitioner. Some might say he was an ambulance chaser. But he had taken on all these clergy sexual abuse lawsuits pro bono, for on a contingency basis. So he wasn't making any money, and he'd been doing this for many years. And all by himself, Mitch had found a way to force the church to hand over documents about a particular priest who had spent 30 years molesting more than 150 children. And even though Mitch got the judge to force the church to turn over these documents, the judge sealed all the records, so they were not available to the public and they were not available to the Boston Globe.
Timothy Lambert was a priest from New York City, and he had quite the story about being abused as a teenager by another priest. Mike had a conversation with Timothy after sexual abuse happened several years ago. Timothy said at that time New York City still had very narrow window for filing civil lawsuits. The statute of limitation runs out really quickly. Still, there are very few child abuse lawsuits, so filing a lawsuit for Timothy was never an option. But he did have a legal counsel that he consulted with, and the lawyer wrote a long detailed letter to the Bishop Tom Daly. As usual, the investigation consisted of the bishop asking the priest if the allegations were true, but the priest denied it, and that was the end of the investigation. He said he's also been to all New York papers and no one would touch the story. Not only because the issue happened in the Catholic Church, but also because the bishop and the church cover up sexual abuse. Mike let Timothy take him to all the places Timothy said sexual abuse issues happen. This is the way for Mike to vet what Timothy told him. For more evidence, he got an affidavit with Timothy's mother's signature to the effect that her son had told her about abuse many years before, around the time that it happened. After that, the Searchlight group of Boston Globe sat around and talked about whether or not they could write the story. They collected all the documents and records that they had at the time. Timothy had told his mother, and they had the signed affidavit from his mother to that fact. They have a letter from their legal counsel and a letter from the attorney, and of course, Timothy's willingness to illustrate the story by taking Mike to all the places that the issues happened. All these documents and records fitted their standard of publishing a news story, so they decided to write the story. Then two things happened after they published. First, the New York Times followed the story right away on page 1, and second, Timothy, as an on-the-job priest, announced the story in front of the entire congregation. After publishing, Mike wanted to interview the priest, but he would not talk to him. 2 years later, the priest was arrested for molesting a kid at Catholic summer camp, and eventually cop a plea. Although he did not go to prison, they feel that they had made the right decision. The tips for journalistic investigation mentioned by two speakers in the above speech are: the first one is, when you are doing an investigation, step 1 is to figure out what your focus is. In this case, their sort of goal was, what is the impact of that policy on the safety of children in the sport? They then started with publicly available information to begin the investigation and to try to figure out how many of these officials had the USA Gymnastics received complaints about prior to them abusing more people, and then how many of these people were harmed because that policy or that practice wasn't reported to begin with. The second tip is to figure out how do you find the human voices that you need to show why this policy is significant and its impact, and try to use news reports, police reports, and court documents in case the person was suing the organization to take that information and figure out who might be willing to talk. The third tip is to try to find an intermediary to contact a survivor of trauma. The intermediary could be an attorney, a victim's advocate, a detective, or a deputy prosecutor. Someone that you know and they know about the abuse. And that's really key, making sure that it's somebody who knows what really happened and might be willing to connect you with that individual. The fourth tip is about naming. If you're using full names, it's really important to have a full conversation with them beforehand to help them understand what could happen. For example, in USA Gymnastics case, Jamie Janser, who was one of the first Larry Nassar survivors, came forward and initially wished to not be named. She later allowed them to name her, but at the time, there was a very careful conversation where Marisa explained to her the ramifications of doing so. So even though people made terrible comments about her on social media, she was aware of this prior to doing so. The fifth tip is not to force people. If somebody is not comfortable using the name, do not force them to take that decision, because once you made somebody use their name, they cannot take it back. The sixth tip is, there is a difference between what you believe as a person and what you can report. You're asking people a lot of very personal questions, and you have to make sure they understand that. There are a lot of survivors the journalists had interviewed, but those stories may never have been shared publicly. Why? Because the story does not meet their threshold for publication. The seventh tip is having a conversation at the beginning so that people don't have expectations. If people share all of this personal trauma to others with the expectation that there would be changes instantly, they would feel let down and betrayed if that doesn't happen. The eighth tip is, usually when you see stories about sexual trauma in publications, you're seeing very general terminology. You're seeing things like molested or sexually abused. You're not seeing incredibly detailed descriptions of the situations. But Marisa mentioned that if you're writing about gymnastic sport that involves a lot of touching, a lot of spotting, and a lot of manipulation of the bodies, in order to show how and what was happening to them, and how that it was not an accidental slip, you need to use very explicit language, which means you have to have those conversations with survivors about very explicit language, because it is really important to help people understand what is exactly going on and why it is different and not in line with procedure. The 9th tip is documentation is very important. When you're doing investigations about sexual crimes, a lot of the time the documentation that is not available becomes really important. Patient medical and health records are incredibly helpful. Most of these, under normal state laws, are not public documents. Speakers prefer getting them from the agencies themselves and to get it from the entity that generated the documents. Of course, you can ask people to provide their own records, but whenever possible, try and get it directly from the agencies. The 10th tip is, when you're doing massive investigations, especially when you're doing investigations that involve multiple people, it becomes really important to have ways to tie all that information together to know where you can find every document that you need. You could use Google Drive, you could use OneDrive, it depends sometimes on what your organization would like you to use. You can also use Document Cloud, which has OCR recognition. The 11th tip is for those of you who do not have investigation teams yet but may in the future. It is really important to familiarize yourself with all the information to get a broader perspective. The 12th tip is about fact-checking. When you're doing investigations into sexual assault, into sexual violence, you have to have a solid basis for publication, a standard that you would meet when you're looking into it. Besides, in the editing process, you need to look up the definition of words. Make sure that you and your team are all on the same page to ensure that if anybody disputes what you're saying, you could point out exactly why you felt that information was relevant.
Do this kind of reporting, you will find yourself in situations that will challenge you ethically and journalistically and psychologically. And you just need to be ready for it. This is a phenomenon that is global, that the practice of the Catholic Church for decades, if not centuries, all over the world has been to cover up a pretty high incidence of child sexual abuse. So I think this is the ultimate story with legs. I don't think it's going to end. If more attorneys general are going to investigate, like the attorneys general in New York and New Jersey, it's just not going to end, particularly when the Vatican refuses to do anything about it. There are a few things I would suggest. One is there probably are attorneys around who have handled these cases, and I bet they've been settled very quietly. And if maybe you've already done this, but I would just start calling lawyers I know in town and asking them, on background, well, who are the attorneys who handle this? Usually it's a specialty for a small group of lawyers who take these cases. And so I would just make those sorts of calls in your own community. Just make sure you know the legal community and who's really likely to take these cases. The other thing now is you can call SNAP, the Survivors Network. They're pretty good. And also there's an organization called Bishop Accountability. And they have this website, bishopaccountability.org, and they have an incredible archive of records. It's hard to navigate. It's not a smooth operating website, which I've told them many, many times. Even when I use the website, I'm never entirely sure I've seen everything, and I'm always worried that I've missed something. But the people who run it, Terry McKiernan and Ann Doyle, they're terrific, and they'll take your calls, and they might be able to help, and they'll help you do some research too.
I think it's just about, as a female journalist in general, like not putting yourself in situations that you can't handle. So if I'm going, as an example, if I'm going to an address and I don't know exactly what I'm getting into, I'm sending that address to multiple editors and other people so that they have it. I'm also, a lot of times I'm traveling with a visual journalist, so there are two people who are there at whatever it is that I'm going to. So just figuring out ways you can get a vibe, generally speaking, and there are exceptions to every rule, but generally when you're reporting, you can tell whether there's something you might need to be concerned about, whether you're going into a dangerous area or you're interviewing somebody who might be dangerous. You just navigate through that and set up safeguards around you.